The history of all hitherto society is the history of class struggle. This is the very first line of the very first chapter of Karl Marx's groundbreaking political document, the Communist Manifesto. And it is this line all communist theory is predicated upon. The idea that there are two classes of people in society, those who rule and those who are ruled. And it is the antagonism between both of these classes which results in a struggle in order to turn the wheels of history, so to speak. The first and most primitive stage of human development, according to Karl Marx, is the stage known as barbarism. And barbarism is when people live in caves, hunt for their sustenance, and forage for their vegetables. That's the most primitive stage of human development, according to Marx and Engels. And from this primitive caveman sort of life, it eventually evolves into the tribal lifestyle. And ironically enough, although Marx and Engels calls tribal people primitive, these were Victorian men after all, so they did use some rather Anglo-centric sort of vernacular. Nevertheless, they do acknowledge that in this primitive stage is when you have some primitive proto-form of communism, because there is no such thing as private property in a tribe. Everything in a tribe is shared, from the spoils of war to the kill of the hunt, and everyone is designated a job, and to each according to his needs and from each according to his means is practiced. But it is from this point when humanity evolves into what we call class society. And the very first vestiges of class society occur in the ancient world with what Engels and Marx call slave society. Now, slave society is basically a society like ancient Rome or Greece or the Han Dynasty China or the or pre-Islamic Mecca. That would be slave society. Now, people in slave society are divided into two classes, freemen and slaves. So, just so you know, slavery wasn't some unique evil that was practiced by evil white men. It wasn't some unique evil of Christian white men, because in the ancient world, well, everybody had no problem with slavery. Virtually nobody had an issue with slavery in most societies. Most people didn't want to be a slave, but most people didn't mind owning a slave. You see, it was quite acceptable in the ancient world. And it is this thing we call slave society which then gives birth to the thing we call class struggle, or the battle for dominion between the ruling class and the class that is subjugated. And in fact, Karl Marx actually considered Spartacus, the ancient Roman gladiator, who was once a slave but became a rebel leader, as one of his heroes. Karl Marx actually described Spartacus as one of the finest fellows in the ancient world. So that is basically slave society, which then evolves into feudal society. Now, feudal society is basically when you have a king, you have ministers. In Malaysia we call them pembesar, and Malaysia is basically the epitome of feudal society, at least in pre-1957. Malaysia was a feudal society. Now, in a feudal society, this is when people basically have to obey the king. There is no such thing as a notion of democracy yet in a feudal society. Not yet. Because people have to bend to the will of the divine monarch. Malaysia is the epitome of feudal society. or what I should rephrase that, Malaya, prior to the British colonization, was what we would describe as a feudal society, in which the king rules over the subjects, and the feudal lords, also known as the Anak Raja, are the representatives of the king, and the people who are ruled over are the peasants. So the peasants till the land, and they give a part of their produce to the feudal lord. And if a peasant were to get too wealthy, well, what would the king do? What would the sultan do? The sultan would just seize any excess wealth from the peasant to go into the royal coffers, and there's nothing the peasant could do about it, right? So then you have what we call capitalist society, which comes after feudal society. And it was in 1793, I believe, when the shackles of feudal society were quite literally cut apart, when Robespierre executed the King of France and basically pushed society into the stage known as capitalism. Now, a lot of people who are not aware think that the French Revolution was a communistic revolution, but it was not actually a communistic revolution because, well, the revolutionary subject in the French Revolution were basically the peasants, and the revolutionary leaders were members of the bourgeoisie, like Robespierre. The bourgeoisie means people who are businessmen, lawyers, artisans, and so on and so forth. There are big bourgeoisie like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, and there are little bourgeoisie, petit bourgeoisie, like the Chinese hawker or the mamak man, basically. Those are petit bourgeoisie. And the people who led the French Revolution and successfully ended the fetters of feudal authority were from the bourgeoisie. So at the time, the bourgeoisie were the revolutionary class. But now, we now live in capitalist society in which the king has been replaced and now taken over. He has been supplanted by the former revolutionary subject, the bourgeoisie, who has become the new ruling class, the new king. And so, it is this stage of human history, the stage known as capitalism, in which the seeds for socialism are planted, according to mainstream Marxist theory. Because the peasant has now shifted in his social consciousness. The peasant is no longer a peasant, but the peasant is now known as a proletariat, a working man who sells his labor power for a wage. Now, in the previous era, the peasant worked for a feudal lord or a pembesar or an anak raja, right? I'm using Malaysian terms to try and explain it to Malaysians. Now, the peasant didn't have any means of upward mobility. If you were born a peasant, he would stay a peasant for life under the feudal system. So the capitalist system, in a sense, did bring about an improvement. And I don't think there's any Marxist in the world who would say that the capitalist ruling system did not bring about some improvement. Because the king can't just have you killed if he doesn't like you, for example. And the king doesn't get to dictate every facet of your life. So the bourgeoisie have played their revolutionary role. And so they are now irrelevant, or I should say, they are now superfluous. Because now, the bourgeoisie has become the new feudal lord under this new system. And the peasant has now become the proletariat, or the working man. And while yes, some proletarians do rise up and become members of the bourgeoisie, generally speaking, the working man only has his labor power to sell. And so the relationship between the bourgeoisie, the business owner, and the working man is like that of the relationship between the feudal lord and the peasant. You see, because the feudal lord could have the peasant killed. For example, a samurai could have a peasant killed at any time if a peasant displeased him. Well, the bourgeoisie cannot have you killed just like that, because we live in more civilized times, but the bourgeoisie can always take away your proverbial rice bowl and you will starve to death. So the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletarian is basically a relationship of coercion, because the bourgeoisie owns something that the proletariat does not own and is unlikely to have any access to owning in his lifetime, and that is known as private property. Now, what is private property? Is private property your car, your house, or your toothbrush? No, it isn't. And don't worry, under a socialist society you won't have to share these things with anyone. No. Private property means the means of production, what we use in order to produce profits, aka capital, das Kapital, which was a book that Karl Marx wrote. He spent 20 years writing about this thing known as private property. But it is private property itself that gives us the tools with which we can destroy the capitalist class. Not destroy them like taking them into a house of special purpose and gunning them down. No, that's not what we mean by destroying the capitalist class. It is the emergence of private property which creates a ruling class and a class that is ruled. But the bourgeoisie have also sowed the seeds of their own destruction, for it is they who basically oppress the people through exploitation and the reproduction of their existence through this exploitation. The contradiction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat is this, for example. In order for someone like Giorgio Armani, the fashion designer, for example, to live a luxurious lifestyle in Italy and buy his third or fourth or fifth yacht or sixth mansion, somebody in Bangladesh has to foot his bill. Therefore, the bourgeoisie has gone from the class that destroyed feudalism and now has become the parasitic class that has replaced the feudalists. As Karl Marx said, labor has created beautiful things. It has created palaces for the rich and hovels for the poor. And if you look at Kuala Lumpur, you can juxtapose a place like Chowkit and a place like Canny Hills, and you can see the contrast between the lives of the working class and the lives of the parasitic class who live on the backs of the working class. So the bourgeoisie, in order to reproduce their own existence, have to exploit people if they want to continue living their grand, luxurious lifestyles. But it is this exploitation that also creates a thing known as class consciousness. When you see members of the bourgeoisie dining in places like Troika in Kuala Lumpur, and you see the employees they employ struggling to put food on the table, this is what creates a thing known as class consciousness among the masses. And it is the masses, due to this class consciousness, that will rise up against their bourgeois oppressors. Now, a smart member of the capitalist class would try to appease the proletariat. Be nicer to them. Give them more free time. Pay them just a little more. That's certainly what Adam Smith would recommend in order to prevent the formation of class consciousness. But by and large, this is not possible if the bourgeoisie wants to keep reproducing its own existence. And so, it is from this position where we now go on to socialism. In a socialist society, socialism is when the bourgeoisie start losing power, and the proletarians, the working class, now seize power in order to basically become the new ruling class. And from socialism, we then progress on to communism, the fifth and final stage in human development. According to Friedrich Engels, this occurs as a result of the withering away of the state. The state will become superfluous because there is no more ruling class, so to speak. So the state will be controlled by everybody, and everybody will be a worker. Now, to be fair, there is no society in the world that has achieved this communist stage yet. Now, you could argue that China is in its socialist stage of development, but by and large, billionaires still exist in China, so you can't say that it's truly a classless society yet. But that is the, if you will pardon me for sounding like a vulgar materialist, it is the ideal, so to speak, of Marxism to create a classless society. And that is the final stage of human development, the most advanced stage of human development, according to Marx. So early on in the video I said there were 5 stages of human development. I am sorry, I miscalculated. I'm not good at math. I failed my math. So there are 6 stages actually. There's barbarism, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and then the final stage, communism. Now, some people have wondered, is it at all possible in order to skip the 4th stage known as capitalism and jump straight from feudalism into socialism? And this is something that theorists have argued over for years and years. But I think the best example to answer our question would be someone like Vladimir Lenin, the Russian socialist who was a student of Marx, who himself was to Marx what King Asoka was to Buddha, because it was Lenin who revived the popularity of Marx and prevented him from going into the dustbin of history. Yeah, Marx was almost relegated into obscurity, if not for Lenin, the Soviet communist leader. Now, Lenin, unlike most dogmatic Marxists of his time, Lenin actually believed that it was possible to skip the capitalist stage and jump straight to the socialist stage of development. And so most socialists at that time did not agree with Lenin because they thought that the peasants would be too reactionary in order to accept this dictatorship of the working class. And the peasants themselves had not even become proletarians. So how could they have a proletarian mindset? That was the idea behind, at least most socialists did not agree with Lenin at that time. But Lenin not only put an end to centuries of imperial Russian Tsarist rule, Lenin also successfully unified the working class and the peasants in order to support him in the formation of his Soviet Republic. Now, of course, this was a historical exception. Malaysia didn't go through the same material conditions as Russia. So the position of the Malay peasant in the time of Chin Peng was different from the position of the Russian peasant in the time of Tsar Nicholas. Now, the Russian peasant in the time of Tsar Nicholas did not necessarily have a proletarian consciousness, but he certainly had class consciousness, because the Russian peasant was living in a cold and depressing place, and the Russian peasant was suffering very, very badly as a result of Tsarist rule. That's not to say that the Malay peasants didn't have their own challenges, but the Malay peasants had different material conditions from the Russian peasant, because by and large the Sultan would leave you alone if you just kept your head low and minded your own business. You would get a plot of land and you would get to plant coconuts, and you get to live quite a quiet life, if you will. But the Russian peasant had been forced into two very, very unpopular wars. One with Japan and one with Germany. The Russian peasant was very, very unhappy with the Tsar. Unhappy enough to support the communist leader Lenin to overthrow the Tsar. See, Malaysia, unlike Russia, also had the inconvenient fact that it was a colonized country. It was colonized by the Brits, who were here precisely because they were trying to fuel their capitalist machine back in Europe. And Malaya at the time had resources such as rubber, tin, timber, copper, and all other goodies that they needed in order to fulfill the demands of the Industrial Revolution. Well, the feudal lords of Malaya and the capitalists of Great Britain basically worked in tandem. They worked in cahoots with each other. In fact, many of the feudal ruling class after 1957 matriculated into the capitalist class. For example, UMNO, United Malays National Organization, the Grand Old Party of Malaysia, the oldest party of our country, it was founded by sons of the feudal lords in the olden days. Tunku Abdul Rahman, our first Prime Minister, for example, was a prince of Kedah. He was the son of the Sultan of Kedah. Winston Churchill himself would have been the son of a feudal lord if he'd been born a century earlier. So you can see that the feudal lords basically matriculated into the new ruling system. It's kind of like how, after Pakatan Harapan wins the election, they matriculate Barisan Nasional into their ranks. That's how it worked. And so it is difficult to revolutionize the people, because the Brits obviously made socialism a very, very unpopular idea. And not only that, well, the people might have been quite suspicious of the idea of socialism, because rather than thinking of it as being a stage in human history, the people of Malaya generally thought of it as a foreign ideology that was brought over by some Chinaman by the name of Chin Peng. Now, of course, you don't want to bring up Chin Peng's name. Chin Peng was the communist leader who led the 40-year jungle war against the Brits, and after that the reactionary government of Malaysia, which he did not regard as the true representatives of the people. But you don't want to bring up his name because, well, the current ruling class of our country are the successors of the British and the feudal lords. Yeah. So are we going to get socialism in Malaysia in our lifetime? I believe so. But it'll not be easy. It'll be an uphill battle trying to convince the masses that socialism is really for everyone's own good, including my own good. But it will not be an easy process. And I will work tirelessly at trying to convince the people that this is the way forward. Now, we've established that in different periods of human history, there have been different types of class antagonisms. For example, in slave society, it was between the slaves and the freemen. And in feudal society, it was between the peasants and the feudal lords, including the kings and the sultans. And in capitalist society, it's between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, or the business class. And so the only way to resolve these contradictions, according to the Marxist worldview, I'm not a Marxist, and neither was Karl Marx, yeah? The only way to resolve these contradictions is through socialism, or the dictatorship of the working class, aka true democracy. Because it is from this true democracy that we can somehow attain a classless society. Maybe not in our lifetimes, but in the lifetimes of our grandchildren. And the last part of my video, I want to talk about Palestine. Why is it that virtually every socialist in the world supports the Palestinian liberation struggle? And well, every reactionary in the world, except Islamic reactionaries, virtually every Western reactionary supports Israel. There's a reason for this. Because you see, the socialist view of human history, whether you're a Marxist or whether you're an anarchist socialist like Bakunin, all socialists agree upon this idea that class struggle forms the basis of human relations up till this point. And it is only through socialism that these class struggles, these antagonisms, if you will, can be resolved. And so, socialists naturally side with what we call the revolutionary subject, or the class that is oppressed by the ruling class. So when we look at a country like Israel occupying Palestine and living well at the expense of the occupied Palestinians and the besieged people in Gaza, we see whether the Palestinians are socialists or not is irrelevant. They could be the most reactionary people in the world, and that doesn't matter, okay? We see the Palestinians and the Gazans as the revolutionary subject. This is called the revolutionary subject in Marxist vernacular. I'm trying my best not to use Marxist vocabulary, but yeah, the Palestinians are the revolutionary subject, and the ruling class are the Israelis. Now, that's not to say that if you are an Israeli that we're saying that you're an evil person, okay? There were also many kind slave masters, believe it or not, who were kind to their slaves. There have always been kind capitalists who are kind to their workers. I'm not saying that if you're a capitalist, you're an evil person, okay? It just so happens that that's your position in the social hierarchy. And I'm sure there were also kind feudal lords, if you look back in history. But that's irrelevant. Whether you're a nice person or not is irrelevant. I'm not saying there are no nice Israelis. There are nice people who were born in Israel who did not choose to be born in Israel, who are there only because they happened to have been born in that country. Just like there were nice people who were born in Imperial Japan as well, right? But the fact of the matter is that you are basically part of the ruling class, whether you like it or not. And the most revolutionary thing you can do in order to support the struggles of the global south, or in order to support the liberation of the oppressed people of the world, is basically to aid in the defeat of your own country. So Lenin, for example, Lenin himself was not part of the peasant class, and he was not part of the working class. Lenin was a lawyer, and he was born into a noble family. So this is what we mean by being a class traitor, but a good sort of class traitor. You see, Lenin and Thomas Sowell are both class traitors, but one's a good class traitor and one's a bad class traitor, right? So yeah, the most revolutionary thing you could do if you call yourself part of the Israeli left is to facilitate the defeat of your country and to basically speak up for the besieged and occupied Palestinians. Or if you are a young person in Israel who is horrified by the atrocities your country is committing, you can refuse to do military service. And when you sit in prison in order to not go and shoot Palestinian people and bomb Palestinian people, you are also engaging in what we call class struggle. So a lot of people in Malaysia ask why is it that the Chinese and the Indians don't support Palestine? And I find this to be a very strange statement, because virtually everyone in the Party Socialist Malaysia, in the Socialist Party of Malaysia, is supporting the Palestinian liberation struggle for the reasons that I've just mentioned, because Palestine is on the right side of the class struggle, and Israel is on the wrong side of the class struggle. Now, of course, as I've said, there's a reason why some Chinese and Indian Malaysians might not feel too eager to support the Palestine cause, because there are a lot of racist right-wing reactionaries in Malaysia who also support Palestine. So it seems very off-putting for many politically indifferent Chinese and Indians, because they see the Palestine cause as a cause that's supported by people like Mahathir, who's a rabid right-wing fascist, and they don't really see it as class struggle. But if you think that Chinese and Indians are indifferent to the Palestine cause, then obviously you have not talked to enough left-wing Chinese and Indians in Malaysia, because I can tell you there are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of Chinese and Indians. For every one Chinese or Indian who is sympathetic to Israel, or for every one Chinese or Indian who is contemptuous to the Palestine cause, there are thousands of Chinese and Indians who also support Palestine. Maybe they don't say it openly on social media because they don't want to alienate their friends or family, but virtually every non-Malay member of the Party Socialist Malaysia, in fact, not virtually, every single member of the Party Socialist Malaysia support Palestine, because Palestine is on the right side of the class struggle and Israel is not. And Israel was formed because the anti-Semites of Europe were unable to live with their Jewish population, and that's why they created this nation state known as Israel. Okay, so Israel itself is an artificial creation that was formed by some of the most rabid anti-Semites like Lord Balfour or Winston Churchill, who even called communism a Jewish conspiracy. Anyway, the fact of the matter is that Zionism itself is not a very, very old philosophy. It's not thousands of years old. It's only 100 over years old. And it was Theodor Herzl who really is the most famous Zionist, who himself was also a European colonialist reactionary. And I would argue that Zionism was actually meant to serve a twofold purpose. It was meant to help the European ruling class by making the European Jewish people serve as useful satellites in the Middle East in order to maintain the class interests of the European bourgeoisie. That's another topic for another video. And also to get the Jews as far away from them as possible, conveniently. But I think Zionism is also meant to try and steer the Jewish population away from communism, because many of the most famous Jewish people in Europe, the most enlightened Jewish people, such as Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and yes, Albert Einstein, even if they weren't communists, they could at least describe themselves as socialists, right? Because socialism is about as Jewish as King David. Because you see, I'm not a Jew, so I don't really have a right to speak on behalf of Jewish people. But Jewish rabbis throughout history, like Hillel, or the most famous Palestinian political philosopher, Jesus Christ, have always preached a socialistic message to look after others and to care for members of the downtrodden. And so, naturally, this is why socialism seems to be very popular among Jewish people, because it is in the Jewish tradition itself, the socialist way of thinking. And so to get the Jews away from socialism, the European ruling class had to create this thing known as Zionism in order to prevent them from developing a sense of class consciousness and developing instead a sense of national ethnic consciousness. And by doing so, they don't realize that they are being screwed over by the very same people who are supposed to be helping them. The Jewish bourgeoisie are screwing over the Jewish proletariat. But it's convenient to shift the blame to the Palestinians so that they don't realize who's picking their pockets. Just like the Malaysian bourgeoisie is very clever. They make the working class Chinese, Malays and Indians fight among themselves, but you do know who made Vincent Tan into a billionaire from a millionaire. It wasn't another Chinese guy, yeah? It was Mahathir. So while we are fighting among ourselves because we believe that the races are against each other, the bourgeoisie are all dining together, regardless of what race or religion they are. So by instilling a sense of race and nation comes first, this idea of that race and nation must come first, this creates a sense of false consciousness in the proletariat Jewish people of the world. If they believe that their salvation is only through this reactionary ideology of Zionism can they truly be saved. So I'm going to end this video now, but I hope that my video has made it clear what class struggle means. So by now I think you should have some idea of what we mean by class struggle and why socialists naturally support Palestine and reactionaries naturally support Israel. So, well, thank you very much and have a wonderful day.